Hello my friends, Stark here. Stark date 2024.07.18. The year is 2024, thus my 1994 Plymouth Grand Voyager is 30 years old. Let's agree to call this an anniversary rather than a birthday, because the build date is September of 1993. Sorry, old pal, I missed your birthday, which was back in September of last year. I bought this minivan in 2014, thus I have owned her for 10 years, 1/3 of her existence. This old minivan has been a great vehicle, and she now has 212,000 miles. She looks rough, but she still drives well. She still goes down the road. Well, she's been semi-retired for the last few years, partly because of ever-increasing age and, frankly, partly because she is a gas guzzler, always has been. V6 engine, acts like it's a V8 in terms of fuel consumption. Have you ever had a vehicle which is reliable yet maintenance heavy? Well, this is just such a vehicle, and in a moment I will read you a list as close to exhaustive as I can remember of all the replacements and repairs that I have executed upon this old minivan. The engine is the excellent Chrysler 3.3 litre V6. My only negative comment about this engine is that it is greedy with respect to fuel consumption. The transmission is a 4-speed Chrysler automatic. Infamously, many people had trouble with 1990s and 2000s Chrysler automatic transmissions. I am convinced, however, that most of the problems were due to improper use of transmission fluid. So when a transmission has a leak, for example, at the transmission oil pan or perhaps at the drive shaft seals, then people would top up the transmission with regular Dexmerk transmission fluid. Well, that just won't do for Chrysler automatic transmissions of this vintage, which require a slipperier fluid with the correct additives. So the keynote is +4. +4 transmission fluid is what's required to give these transmissions a long life. Now, I'm not recommending this particular brand, Parts Master. This is simply what's local to me, what I buy. It's the +4 that's the key. Alright, over 10 years of ownership, these are the repairs and replacements that I can recall. Engine oil and filter changes, many. Engine oil pan gasket, transmission fluid, transmission filter and pan gasket, coolant, air filter, battery, spark plugs, serpentine belt tensioner, outer tie rods, both sides, lower ball joints, both sides, front brake pads, front brake calipers, rear brake shoes, rear brake wheel cylinders, front hubs, left and right, front drive shafts, left and right, strut assemblies, left and right, fuel pump, radiator, lower radiator hose, thermostat, hatch struts, windshield, and the rear right hub. I want to talk a moment about the replacement of the rear right hub, because that was a repair that most people will never need to handle. Frankly, it's a failure that shouldn't have happened, yet did. This is a front hub, a driven hub for a front-wheel drive vehicle, and you can see the grooves that mate with the splines of the drive shaft. The back side of a front-driven hub is bolted to the steering knuckle, typically in 3 to 5 locations, depending upon the motor vehicle. And the hub is required to be bolted to the steering knuckle because the steering knuckle is a moving part. It rotates left and right as the driver steers the vehicle. On a front-wheel drive driven hub, the bearings are typically integrated into the hub. So when you purchase a new hub, you buy new bearings too. It's all included in the unit. The drive shaft penetrates the hub and is secured by an axle nut, sometimes accompanied by a washer. And yes, I know this isn't really an axle, I'm just using a pipe for illustrative purposes. Modern front-wheel drive vehicles have rear hubs that are very similar to the front hubs. They bolt into place and they have integrated wheel bearings. The only difference is that they don't require the internal spline because there's no drive shaft. They're tail-dragging hubs and their function is only to support the rear wheels. Older front-wheel drive vehicles, such as this dated minivan, do not have independent rear suspension. You can see that the two sides are tied together by this enormous de Dion bar. It's almost the size of a rear axle on a rear-wheel drive vehicle. That design decision has consequences for the rear hubs. The designers could have used modern hubs that bolt on and have integrated bearings, but they didn't need to, because the old-fashioned suspension allowed them to use old-fashioned hubs, which are simpler and cheaper to manufacture. Essentially, the de Dion bar is an undriven axle. At each side is a fixed spindle. The cast iron hubs have steel studs. The hubs rotate about the spindle via a pair of replaceable wheel bearings, the inner bearing and the outer bearing. These bearings may be replaced or may be repacked with grease. The ends of the spindles are threaded to accommodate an axle nut, but unlike the front hubs, these old-fashioned rear hubs are low torque to permit the old-fashioned replaceable wheel bearings to have a little play or wiggle room. If the axle nut is torqued, it's behind this grease cover, then the rear wheel bearings will overheat. You can see the outer face of the hub here. This is not the brake drum. So why am I telling you all this? I had a brake jam on the rear right brake drum assembly. Consequently, excessive heat cracked the cast iron hub. And once that hub cracks and starts to split apart, there's nothing left to support the inner and outer wheel bearings. The rear right wheel was simply wobbling around on the spindle. Wheel bearing failure is common, but a broken cast iron hub is almost unheard of. The problem was that the rear hubs are obsolete. I was unable to identify a manufacturer and unable to identify any in stock anywhere. My only recourse was to attempt to locate either a Plymouth Grand Voyager or Dodge Grand Caravan at a salvage yard. It had to be a Grand minivan because the stud spacing is wider for the Grand minivans than the standard wheel-based models. That's because the Grand minivans were equipped with 15-inch wheels, whereas the standard models were equipped with 14-inch wheels. After months of searching, I found a Dodge Grand Caravan from which I was able to remove one of the rear hubs. Of course, I fitted new wheel bearings into the hub. Obtaining the wheel bearings is simple. They are readily available. It's the cast iron hub itself that is obsolete. Well, I love original mint condition vehicles as much as you do, but this isn't it. In fact, this vehicle is highly modified, and I'll show you some of the modifications that I have executed over my 10 years of ownership. Some of them are real improvements, and some of them are hillbilly hacks that just got me by. The right side sill panel rusted in various places. I cut out the rust and I welded in repair plates. The repairs are structurally sound, but not professional grade beauty. Thus, I decided to disguise the repairs by repainting the entire vehicle with the exception of the roof. I used boat deck paint, which I applied with a roller. I recorded that experience, and if you would like to see that video, then see the link in the description for this video. So this boat deck paint is intentionally stippled and rugged to reduce the likelihood that a sailor will slip on the deck and fall into the ocean. And I think it gives this vehicle an interesting external texture. No regrets, I really like it. Originally, the minivan had steel wheels. I replaced those steel wheels with aluminum wheels from a Chevrolet. The stud pattern is the same. I think it brightens the appearance just a little, and it reduces the unsprung weight for, at least theoretically, better handling. I had heavy-duty tires fitted. At least heavy-duty for a minivan. These tires have additional plies. When the hood release cable broke, I had to, unfortunately, break the original plastic grille in order to open the hood. Can you guess the origin of the replacement grille? Yes, it's the shroud from an external air conditioning unit, the type that you would see outside a residence or an office block. Here's my handy replacement hood release. External, just like an old car. I added a transmission cooler to extend the life of the transmission. Despite the fact that this engine bay is both deep and relatively spacious, the 3.3 litre engine creates a lot of heat, and that heat is then entrapped within the engine bay. It doesn't vent out well. I added this steel heatsink, which is bolted to the intake manifold, in an effort to conduct some of the heat away from the engine. Can you guess the original purpose of this heatsink? It is a cooling fan from a lawn tractor. I was very lucky when the fuel pump failed, because the minivan was parked here inside my building. I was so fortunate that it didn't happen out on the road miles away. I decided to cut the carpet and cut an access port into the floor of the minivan, such that I could replace the fuel pump without dropping the fuel tank. I knew that if the new fuel pump were ever to fail, and it hasn't, then I wouldn't be lucky twice. Next time I would be stranded miles away. I covered the access port with an aluminum plate, and the origin of that aluminum plate is a commercial mud flap. At the rear of the vehicle, I have added additional leaves to the leaf spring suspension, such that the minivan is less likely to squat when heavily loaded. This minivan has always had soft front suspension, certainly much softer than I like. And I feel that is deleterious to the handling. I have replaced both of the front strut assemblies, left and right, and that has improved the suspension and handling, yet it still leaves room for improvement. If you don't know what the strut assembly is, then it is everything above the steering knuckle. So the column, the coil spring, and the shock absorber packaged into one convenient unit. Before I replaced the front struts, that soft, worn-out suspension would often allow the engine oil pan to bottom out on the road surface and literally scrape the road. I hated that because I was terrified that at the next big bump I would abrade just enough steel that I would tear through the oil pan, lose the engine's oil capacity, and ruin the engine. I replaced the damaged and scraped oil pan with a good one, but before paint and installation, I welded a trio of angle brackets to the floor of the oil pan, such that if the oil pan ever bottoms out on the road surface again, and it hasn't, then the oil pan will be protected by these angle brackets. They also serve as fins, so at least in theory, I have improved heat dissipation because I've increased the surface area of the oil pan. Here's an entirely whimsical modification. When I replaced the transmission filter and transmission oil pan gasket, I took the opportunity to repaint the transmission oil pan in luminous yellow. The original rear bumper was plastic over a steel core, but that steel bumper core completely rusted. I mean, it was falling apart with rust. It was riddled with rust. I replaced that steel bumper core with an aluminum bumper core from a Volvo S70. So what are the differences between the standard minivan and the grand minivans? So let's ignore the badge engineering. Essentially, a Plymouth Voyager is the same as a Dodge Caravan, and a Dodge Grand Caravan is the same as a Plymouth Grand Voyager. If Grand is in the name, then the wheelbase is extended. The Grand vehicles have 15-inch wheels instead of 14-inch, and a significantly longer rear side window. In back, the Grand minivans have, at least a couple of feet between the third row seat and the rear hatch, whereas the standard minivan has almost no space between the third row seat and the rear hatch. In those vehicles, The back seat is right here. I carry 2 spare wheels, a full-size wheel and a donut. I think that the sliding door is a little larger upon the Grand minivan than the standard model, but I could be wrong. If you know better, then please correct me in the comments below. Sadly, the sliding door is now super rusty and certainly beyond my ability to repair. So really, I need a replacement sliding door. But these first and second generation Chrysler minivans are becoming difficult to find. This is a second generation, 1992 to 1995. Commencing 1996 for the third generation, Chrysler minivans have dual sliding doors, but up to and including 1995, so first and second generations, they have only the right side sliding door. Notice that the exterior door handle of the sliding door is identical to the door handle of the front left door. It's simply rotated through 90 degrees. Chrysler saved development and construction costs wherever possible. Well, thank you so much for enduring this 30th anniversary special for the 1994 Plymouth Grand Voyager. Let's end the video by driving a circuit around the property. This engine has always had plenty of power. I don't know whether the transmission was rebuilt at some time before 2014 when I acquired the vehicle, yet I have had no trouble with the Chrysler transmission. But I used only ATF plus 4. Thank you so much for watching, my friends. Take care. See you next time.